If I asked you to picture life in Iron Age Britain, well, you may conjure up images of warrior kings, battles, intertribal battles, control of lands, lands passed down through son to son through their lineage, returning home to their dutiful wives and children, cooking around the campfire. But what if I told you that that may well have been a significant misconception of that period of time, the late Iron Age? And maybe the archaeologists have been trying to tell us something for a very long time, in fact since the 1970s, but we didn't really want to listen, and now it's about time we did. This perception, this misunderstanding that I for one am as guilty as anybody for perpetuating, comes to an end now, January 2025, with the publication of a paper that changes how we, the laymen, see a defining era of history. Welcome to the story of how we misunderstood the Iron Age. I'm pretty confident that you have heard of the story of Boudica. It plays a really important role here. Boudica was the wife of Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in the east of Britain. For all intents and purposes, he was a client king of the Roman Empire. Now, upon his death, he left his lands to his wife and daughters. As you can imagine, the Romans weren't having any of this, and according to the Roman historian himself, Tacitus, well, he suggests that Boudica was flogged and the daughters were assaulted. Subsequently, we see the uprising of the Iceni tribe and maybe others too, led by Boudica, and they went on to level Colchester, London and St Albans. The story for Boudica and her revolt ended soon after this at the hands of Suetonius. So we have Boudica. This isn't, however, the first time we've heard of a queen of an Iron Age tribe here in Britannia. In fact, 17 years or so before the short-lived reign of Boudica, 43 AD, and we hear from, again, Tacitus, there is an Iron Age queen named Cartimandua, queen of the Brigantes tribe in what is now the north of England, quite a significant territory. It's likely that, as with Prasutagus of the Iceni, well, Cartimandua was some kind of client queen. Her reign lasted sometime after the Romans' successful invasion of Britain. Tacitus writes that Cartimandua had strengthened her power when she was credited with capturing King Caratacus by treachery. So this was big, because when she divorced and sought concert in her ex-husband's squire, well, that's when things started to go quite wrong for her. Now, that's a whole story for another day, which we won't really go much further, but the big takeaway from this is we have two Iron Age queens, two leaders of significant tribes in the Iron Age in Britannia. Now, that was of course written from the eyes of the Romans. Iron Age remains and grave goods in Western Europe have already hinted to us that females may well have had a very high status in society, perhaps equal or greater than males. But here in Britain, well, Iron Age human remains are relatively rare. It's often seen that perhaps the way of dealing with the dead was via cremation. Oh, that is with the exception of a tribe here in southern Britain known as the Durotriges. They occupied an area similar to that of Dorset today, a bit of Wiltshire, a bit of Somerset as well. As with a small handful of Iron Age tribes, well, we know a little about the Durotriges through their coinage. Now, we don't have any inscriptions on them, so we don't know of their leaders, their kings or their queens. Nothing but a broad layout of the land based on where those coins were found. That's it, that's all we've got. The Durotriges, almost certainly as a tribe, wouldn't have been using hill forts like this. These were long out of use by perhaps 100 BC when we start to see those coins creep into the societies of the time. Then we come back to the burials, because like many in Western Europe, sort of oval, shallow graves, Durotriges were laid in a crouched position. Now, we used to think that the Durotriges strongly resisted the Roman invasion, with early archaeology in the 1930s from the Wheelers telling us that this was the case, but today we see a different story. Work from Miles Russell, Niall Sharples has highlighted that the Romans were perhaps met with a peaceful tribe, more intent on their farmsteads than war. Miles Russell and his team at Bournemouth University continue to work on these projects, now referred to as the Durotriges project, and it's done so much for the understanding of the Iron Age here. People here, the culture, their relationship with the Romans, and that paper, well, that took perhaps the most significant leap forward in our understanding of Iron Age Britain, not just here in southern Britain, but perhaps the Iron Age culture as a whole. And here is exactly how. Okay, so I've just walked up that lane there, happens to be a Roman road actually, to try and give you a better view of these houses here. That just so happens to be one of the earliest established towns in the UK. Now, back in 2008-2009, Miles Russell and Paul Cheetham discovered just across the way there a 32,000 metre Iron Age settlement, now dubbed Duropolis, and that settlement would tell us so much about the Iron Age. 2015, the site was found to have 150 features, scores of roundhouses, 16 of which have been excavated, dating us to approximately 100 BC. Now, importantly for us today, we do have burials. To be clear, this wasn't the first time an Iron Age grave was dug. It wasn't the first time an Iron Age grave was analysed in a genomic way. But what was different about this study is this would one day give us DNA analysis from multiple people, from multiple generations, all on the same site. When I was a kid, I was sometimes dragged around our local Iron Age museum. Had no interest at the time, but I do look back with fond memories. And in that museum, well, there would be the male warriors, there'd be chariots, there'd be all kinds of perceptions of a very male-led society, and the females would be back at camp cooking around the campfire with the children. And of course, add to that I grew up in a very sort of male-led society in the 1980s. All of that gives you this huge perception. That's how life is and probably was for many years. But here is the thing. Even in that era, we didn't challenge this, despite French archaeologists discussing the matriarchal society in the 1970s. The 1990s, Roy Hodgson highlighted that in Austria during the Iron Age, well, women had equal apex status. 2004, Thomas Evans published an analysis of grave goods from Iron Age burials in the Paris Basin, highlighting that men and women appeared to have equal status. Move forward 2011, Dr. Rachel Pope published an analysis of Iron Age graves here in Britain, revealing equal treatment and access to high status goods. Now, this list goes on, and we're continually now fed with headlines sensationalising this like we never knew it before. The fact that females may have played a greater role in the late Iron Age than we never knew, and perhaps the society was even more equal then than it was when I grew up in the 1980s. But here's the thing, archaeologists have been trying to tell us this for a very long time. We just didn't want to hear it. So back here at Duropolis, well, we now have the skeletal remains of 55 individuals. 55 individuals. Now, the goal is to use DNA analysis to try, at worst, to understand more about the society here and how those people lived and worked. But at best, well, maybe we could try and confirm what archaeologists have been shouting about for many years now by way of the grave goods finds from here across into Europe. We have heard by way of the Romans that female leaders were present in the Iron Age. We've seen archaeologists tell us for over half a century that their place in society was in many cases equal. So what did the science say? Well, it turns out everything that was suspected about that Iron Age society was true, perhaps even more so than we could have ever imagined. Now, the usual disclaimer applies here. I'm no academic, I'm no historian or even archaeologist. Now, I will link the paper here in the description below. Have a look at it yourself. It's quite heavy going. There is no attempt on my part to sort of misrepresent it in any way. Just understand it as best I can. But have a look and good luck. So of the 55 remains, well, 40 had enough to give us a complete picture of their genome. It's important to understand at this stage what mitochondrial DNA is. So essentially it's the DNA passed down from mother to child. Y chromosomes were also used here in this analysis. They are passed from father to son. Dr. Lara Cassidy, author of the paper, suggested that they were able to reconstruct family trees with many different branches, and they found that most members traced their maternal lineage back to a single female who will have lived here centuries before. So when they analysed the father line, the paternal line, well, it showed that those relationships were absent. The Y chromosome diversity amongst the cemetery's men, that showed that they all came from elsewhere. The female line, however, in almost all cases were local. Dozens of family members all came from one single matriline. Now on the flip side, 8 out of 10 of those that didn't come from that family line, well, they were males. So we can conclude from that the males, the husbands, came to join their wives from outside of the community, and maybe the land was passed down from female to female from multiple generations. A further 156 archaeological sites were analysed from around the country, from every era you can imagine: Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age, and it established that the 17 lowest diversity communities all came from the Iron Age. And again, it highlighted the extremely high diversity of the Y chromosome. And hugely interesting, and we can now say two things. One, this gives us some substance to the writings we have from the Romans, suggesting that tribes here in some instances were led by females. Secondly, it underlines what academics have been telling us for quite some time. This isn't new. If anything, it simply underlines it. We just didn't listen for whatever reason in the first case. Preconceptions and prejudice crept in. But what we do know now, and what is new, is that those males came from somewhere, moved into these societies and these communities here, and married and were buried with their wives. Now, the questions of course come from that, as why did they come here, what were their motivations, why did they travel in this way, and how did the society become to be evolved like that? Fascinating new questions from the Durotriges project and all the others that were involved with that paper. Dr. Lara Cassidy, significant part I think on the DNA analysis. Forgive me if I got that wrong, I'll put all the links in the doobly-doo below. And of course, if you've enjoyed this and you're going to love how we misunderstood hill forts, I'll put the link to that somewhere up here. I've been Paul, I'll see you this time next week.